Welcome to Exploring the Bioage. This is part 4 of our Pampas puzzles, and we'll be investigating the rodents of the Pampas and explaining why, doing our best to explain why, the really large mega herbivores in the late Pleistocene were usurped by a wide variety of rodents. Looking forward to it, Anthony.
Yes, well, just to refresh listeners' minds about the context again, we're talking about Buenos Aires province in the country of Argentina in South America, and having covered the mega herbivores of the late Pleistocene, and then the smaller but still fairly large mammals of the late Pleistocene, ranging from about 20 kilos up to just short of a ton. We can now go to the Holocene, to the period since 12,000 years ago, and look at which herbivores occur after the extinction of the mega herbivores and most of the other herbivorous mammals. And what we find remarkably, as we've pointed out in previous segments, is that a diverse and impressive megafauna was entirely replaced by animals that are also grazers, also have diets specializing on green grass, but are nothing more than rodents. And so when the Spanish arrived at the Pampas in 1516 in search of silver, what they found was a vast grassland, fertile, well-watered, that had nothing larger than 50 kilograms on it in terms of native mammals. And the most important grazers in that ecosystem that the Spaniards encountered was animals much smaller than that, about 5 kilograms in body mass, basically invisible. So, whereas the African savannas have large animals visible on all sides, essentially the Pampas, in the eyes of the Spaniards, had nothing visible because the rodents were not really even visible for most of the time, some of them being burrowing animals. So what were these rodents? Now, what's most interesting about these rodents is that they are larger than comparable rodents elsewhere in the world and more specialized for grazing, and in a sense also more fecund. And we can begin with perhaps the most familiar, because there's 4 different types of rodents that were common in the Pampas before this sea of grassland was changed forever by farming. Now, the first one is a wild relative of the guinea pig, a species called Cavia aperea. In other words, a wild cavy, which is quite possibly one of the ancestors of the domestic guinea pig, Cavia porcellus. And this cavy is unlike herbivorous rodents elsewhere in the world because it's bigger than voles. In the northern hemisphere, both North America and Europe, you have various voles which are fully herbivorous and are quite similar to guinea pigs, but they're smaller. For example, in the tundra, there are many voles, including lemmings, which are fully herbivorous, but they're rather small animals by comparison. Cavia aperea, this ancestor of the domestic guinea pig, was about 0.6 kilograms. So we can call it half a kilogram in body mass. And it simply foraged in the grassland without burrows, often in little groups. So it was like a mini antelope in some sense, in the sense that it was just grazing grass out in the open, hiding in amongst the grass, but not without any particularly complex social structure or refuge system, and simply relying on its extremely impressive fecundity to survive predation. Now, in terms of its fecundity, what's remarkable about Cavia aperea and guinea pigs in general is how precocial it is, because most rodents have fairly small babies, but guinea pigs, as anybody who's kept guinea pigs will know, have enormous babies that come out essentially fully formed, much like a wildebeest. They come out at a remarkably advanced stage of development. And in fact, lactation in these guinea pig-like animals is almost like a token. It's almost like a formality, in the sense that while there is a suckling period for a juvenile guinea pig, it starts eating green grass almost immediately as well. And so the whole concept of weaning, in a guinea pig is almost like non-applicable, in the sense that these animals are so fully formed when they come out of the mother that they're more or less ready to go. They're just like miniature adults. And that is part of an unusual syndrome in these South American herbivorous rodents, in which one of their main anti-predator adaptations seems to be precociality. So from this wild guinea pig, we go to the opposite end of the body size range into what is essentially the largest guinea pig in history, which is the capybara, Hydrocoirus hydrochirus. And here we have essentially a giant guinea pig weighing about 50 kilograms. In other words, about 10-fold more massive than the wild cavy, that essentially does the same thing. It occurs in the Pampas in association with water, but that's not difficult because much of the Pampas was flooded in the rainy seasons. And so here we have, essentially an antelope-sized chunky rodent that is specialized for eating greens. And like the cavy, has an extremely specialized digestive system consisting of what we call cecotrophy. Now, what cecotrophy is let's go back and look at ruminants. Ruminants have a very complex foregut in which they ferment their food and then chew it again in order to digest it very efficiently. Now, the cavy and the capybara have a similarly efficient method of eating greens, but they do it with the hindgut. And the way they do it, instead of chewing the cud, is they chew their own feces. So imagine a deer. It ferments the food in its foregut and then by peristalsis brings it up the throat into the mouth for further chewing. Capybaras and cavies do much the same thing, but out the other end. So they produce two kinds of feces. One is spent feces that are not eaten, but the other is soft, nutritious feces that they eat directly from their anus, simply by bending down with the mouth at the anus, and then without allowing the fecal pellet to land on the ground, they just take it straight in and chew it again and then swallow it again. And this goes on and on, round and round until they've thoroughly extracted all the nourishment out of the food. And so they're very efficient digesters, just like ruminants, although using a different method. And that helps them to be very fecund, fast-growing, and very powerful ecologically in terms of consuming grass, to the degree that they might actually be able to emulate much larger animals like antelopes and deer in the effect that they have on the vegetation. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I know we have some other rodents to look at, but perhaps I can ask a burning question, and that is, if one is a hunter-gatherer in the Pampas, say 5,000 years ago, would you be able to get as much meat out of those rodents as you would if the Pampas had been full of millions of Pampas deer, for example? Do you think it would have been as productive for the hunter-gatherer?
Well, that's the burning question. That's the $64,000 question, and it is plausible. It has not been demonstrated, but it's a tantalizing possibility. And it kind of makes it makes some sense in the light of two facts that we know about the cavia and the capybara hydrocoirus, which is that to this day they are an important form of livestock in South America. The capybara is the only largish mammal in South America that has done quite well under the onslaught of civilization. It's still quite common on many cattle ranches, and it's hunted for its meat in a way that's sustainable, because it's abundant enough and fecund enough that it can actually sustain a level of offtake by hunting that many other herbivores can't do. And so it's like a giant guinea pig. And guinea pigs themselves were domesticated as meat animals, not as fondling pets. And to this day, in many places in South America, as far afield as Peru, the guinea pig is a staple diet in villages because it can be kept on greens in little cages, and it's extremely productive, produces lovely fatty meat, and is something like the way we regard chicken in our society, in the sense that basically many people have them. They think nothing of it, but there's a constant production stream with guinea pigs and they're very productive as livestock. Whether ultimately the production is more or less efficient than that of large animals is hard to say without doing a detailed study. But there's certainly these relatively large herbivorous rodents of the Pampas are certainly productive enough that they hypothetically rival bigger livestock in terms of converting greens into edible meat.
Yeah, the thought just crossed my mind that humans have altered ecosystems for millennia, and there's the tantalizing possibility that the hunter-gatherers of the Holocene and the Pampas would have purposefully got rid of the large animals to allow the rodents to thrive even more. They would have seen the large animals as the competition for these highly fecund rodents, and they might have steered the Pampas towards the rodent, a grassland dominated by rodents.
I think that's a bridge too far. I think that it's one thing to say that the mega herbivores and larger herbivores were exterminated by human folly through a miscalculation of what's sustainable or not, and that seems to have happened in many situations around the world with human history.
Right.
And then that despite that folly, there was still a living to be made for the Aboriginal hunter-gatherers of the Pampas at the time of Spanish discovery in the form of rodents, because we know that those people lived in leather tents made out of the skins of these rodents and were, probably just having the rodents as a staple diet. So it's one thing to live through your own folly of exterminating all the big animals in your ecosystem and fall on your feet in the form of eating rodents. It's another thing to think that extermination spate was something that they deliberately did in some sort of ecological calculation, that they would be better off and have a more productive herbivore base at the end of it. If that were true, then that would be truly ecologically spectacular. But it seems implausible to me.
Okay.
Because
no.
One of my main reasons for doubting it is that if it were true that a guinea pig or even a capybara could be a more productive option in livestock farming than a large ungulate of the size of a sheep or a bast, then that's the way that pastoralism would have gone in the world. The pastoral situations of the Maasai or the Finns or all sorts of pastoral people in the world would have been selected towards the husbandry of smaller animals like lemmings and hares, perhaps. But that's not the way it's gone.
Sure, but I could perhaps counter that by saying, well, the Pampas is quite unique in terms of its fertility, and it wouldn't work trying to use capybaras or guinea pigs or other rodents in other grasslands in the world because there would have been some sort of mineral deficiency compared with the Pampas.
Yes, well, that's absolutely true. So there's at least two factors involved in this assessment. One is the relative efficiencies, the relative conversion rates and conversion efficiencies of larger versus smaller herbivores. And the other one is the ecological situation involved, because it's true that most pastoral systems around the world are not particularly fertile. They're also rather dry. And so it is possible that in this optimal situation where you have a Pampas that is both well-watered and fertile, there's an opportunity for expressing the maximum productivity in the form of surprisingly small but fecund animals. But again, yes, you've persuaded me that it's more plausible than I initially thought, but I still think that if that were demonstrated, it would be one of the most ecologically spectacular things that's ever been demonstrated, because it would uncover an extremely powerful principle in ecology, of which there's no real hint in the literature.
Sure.
I mean, for example, we hear these days of people talking more about harvesting insects for human food. But there's a good reason why there are virtually no herbivorous insects that are farmed to any extent anywhere in the world. And that's because with an ectothermic herbivore like a locust or a grasshopper or even various beetles, there's tremendous inefficiency. This idea that the human population would be better off eating bugs is deeply flawed ecologically, because insects are just not efficient enough to be competitive as livestock. They just don't digest fast enough. They just don't have the pace of life that can sustain livestock systems. But there's a difference between insects, of course, of a few grams on the one hand, and rodents of 5 grams or more, because it could be that these rodents are big enough to emulate in some way ungulates. So anyway, we can't say, but this is a great search image and a great hypothesis to put out there for other people to think about and work on. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, agreed. And it is strange that farming guinea pigs hasn't taken off across the planet, assuming that rodents could produce more meat per unit area than ungulates. Not wanting to go down a rabbit hole, but just to flag that I took some samples of Pampas soil about 25 years ago, and the one element that was sky high that really caught my attention and other soil science colleagues' attention was selenium. Incredibly rich in selenium, the soils that are sampled near Buenos Aires. And as we both know, selenium is often extremely deficient in other ecosystems, causing great problems for large mammals, herbivorous mammals. White muscle disease, as you know, is a selenium deficiency, where these large ungulates, when chased, can literally fall dead in their tracks because of the selenium deficiency. So perhaps there's an angle there, but we should also return to the other two rodent families that you wanted to discuss, and also perhaps contemplate why the rodents took over in the Pampas, because we do have some thoughts on perhaps climatic change, for example.
Yeah, well, let's put a pin in that selenium topic, because it's truly fascinating and full of potential. It really is an exciting thing to consider how selenium works in the world ecologically. But okay, so to complete the quartet of our 4 important herbivorous, specialized, rather large grass-eating rodents in the Pampas, having covered the size range from Cavia apirea, about half a kilo, through to the capybara of about 50 kilos, tenfold greater, now we fill in the middle, because what we have in the middle at a body size of about 5 kilograms, which is about the size of a large tomcat, you've got 2 different species which are equally efficient and equally productive of food in their own way. And they are the coipu, Myocastor coipus, and the plains viscacha, Lagostomus maximus. They belong to different families of rodents, but the coipu is semi-aquatic, whereas the plains viscacha is restricted to dry land and depends on complex burrow systems, partly analogous to the prairie dogs of North America. But in both cases, you've got essentially grazing rodents that are extremely productive, precocial again, and have been harvested intensely in various situations by humans. And my bet would be that in the ecosystem of the Pampas, as discovered by the Spaniards in around 1500, I would say probably the main diet of those people would have been coipu and plains viscacha, with the cavy and the capybara playing subsidiary roles. So evidence that these particular medium-sized 5 kilogram grazing rodents, which are also cecotrophic, by the way, with the same digestive efficiencies as the cavy and the capybara, evidence of their power ecologically can be found in the fact that as soon as the Pampas started to be farmed by European people in around the 1800s, the first thing they did was to exterminate the viscacha, simply because it's such a powerful herbivore that it was obviously competing with ungulate livestock. And so today the vizcacha has been exterminated from most of Buenos Aires province for no reason other than that farmers will not tolerate its presence. It's regarded as a relatively undesirable herbivore. But it would have been productive enough based on that ecological power to have been a powerful food source for the original people. And secondly, the koipu was exported to various parts of the world, not for its meat, but for other products. And it was so powerful ecologically that it became an outright pest in several places, including Japan and several places in the Northern Hemisphere, and had to be eradicated deliberately because it wasn't just an introduced animal, it was an invasive pest. So in their own ways, each of these four main herbivorous rodents of the Pampas have shown us that they are unusually powerful ecologically, and they also share some other characteristics that we haven't fully interpreted yet, such as their precociality. But among them, as a guild of four species, they do offer a fairly respectable alternative for the larger mammals that originally inhabited Buenos Aires province.
And there's really no equivalent elsewhere across the planet, Anthony, or could you look at prairie dogs, gophers, voles, mole rats in southern Africa? Any other equivalents, or are these just four supercharged rodents in the Pampas compared with other ecosystems?
Yeah, there are partial equivalents, and
okay.
This is one of the cases where it's like the exception proves the rule. The first equivalent to go for is the set of prairie dogs in North America, particularly Siamese ludovicianus, the black-tailed prairie dog, because there are enough analogies between the black-tailed prairie dog of the prairies, the treeless grasslands of North America, and the plains vizcacha, that it offers an obvious comparison. But the difference is that the prairie dog is only a fifth of the size of the plains vizcacha. It's a much smaller animal, and it's related to squirrels. It's essentially a ground squirrel, an extremely socially complex ground squirrel. And although it does eat mainly grass, it's not as restricted to grass as the plains vizcacha is. It also eats, it tends more towards omnivory in a way. And essentially the difference is that the prairie dogs are subsidiary or subordinate to the large ungulates such as the bison, whereas the plains vizcacha has replaced the large herbivores. So you can only push that comparison so far before it breaks down. Now let's move to the continent of Africa. In Africa, there is one species that is downright comparable with the large rodents of the Pampas, and that is the cane rat, Thrionomes swinderianus, which is widespread in a certain ecosystem across the savannas of West, Central, and Southern Africa. And it's very comparable in the sense that it's large. It's around 5 kilograms. It's about the same size as a koipu or a plains vizcacha. And it's cecotrophic. It's herbivorous. It's very productive. It's often kept in African villages as a source of meat. It's like a giant guinea pig. Important enough in West Africa to have a sort of husbandry literature around it. But the difference is that the cane rat is very restricted in Africa to essentially to reed beds. It's not an animal that you find out in the open savanna, and it's certainly not an animal you'd find in treeless grassland like the Serengeti or the Highveld. And so it's been marginalized by all of the competing ungulates in Africa. It hasn't, the competition from ungulates has not completely excluded this particular type of herbivore, the large cecotrophic grazer, but it's restricted the cane rat to a particular niche, as it were, that in the overall scheme of things in Africa is relatively trivial. And so it's kind of an exception that proves the rule. Elsewhere in the world, you've got, for example, in the Asian steppes, the treeless grasslands of Kazakhstan through to Mongolia, you've got a particular kind of marmot, which is, again, a similar sort of rodent. But a major difference is that it hibernates. And so for much of the year, it's not actually ecologically operative. And so it falls short of any complete comparison with the animals in South America. So it's a case of so near and yet so far, because this particular kind of animal, the general ecological strategy exhibited by the Pampas rodents is certainly not unique. But if you look at the combination of their particular fecundity and precociality, their particularly large body size, as epitomized by the capybara, and their particular thorough domination of the landscape, then there's nothing in the world that really emulates them. The closest thing in terms of emulation is what you find in the far north, in the far frigid north, where lemmings and various voles are more important than ungulates as herbivores. But you see, the big difference is that lemmings and voles are much, much smaller. You're talking about animals of only a few hundred grams, as opposed to animals in our case ranging from half a kilogram, 500 grams, through to 50 kilograms. So if you take the various aspects of the comparison, there's nothing else in the world that really adds up in the same way.
And the mole rats, they're also quite powerful in their own right, and appear quite abundant in certain grasslands or even fynbos in southern Africa. But I'm assuming they just don't have the same fecundity or ecosystem impact. Although we've discussed in the past how much soil turnover occurs as a result of mole rat burrows. So they do strike one as quite powerful animals.
Yes, well, when you talk about mole rats, it's a complex category of burrowing rodents belonging to anything up to 7 families around the world. That also is quite diverse in its diet, in their diets and in their life history strategies. So, for example, most of the mole rats in southern Africa are mainly eaters of underground plant parts as opposed to above ground greens. And so they're not really comparable. They're also, they don't have nearly the same pace of life. They're rather slow metabolically. And so they're not as productive by a long shot. When it comes to North America, the pocket gophers, the equivalent in North America of a mole rat is a pocket gopher. And the pocket gopher is more comparable to a Pampas rodent in the sense that the way it often forages is to live underground, but to pull down above ground greens into its burrow and to eat it there.
Yeah.
But you see, that doesn't really help, because in the Pampas we have a similar kind of animal called the tuco, the genus Ctenomys in the family Ctenomyidae, that acts like a gopher. And so to the degree that gophers are important in North America, there are also gophers eating greens in the Pampas. And so one is no further ahead. And so if you take a combination of body size, pace of life and fecundity, and dietary specialization, there's no real mole rat kind of animal anywhere in the world that can emulate what we've described in the Pampas.
Yeah. I imagine Australia is also unlikely to have anything closely resembling such rodents, or is there even one animal to pick out as a possible comparison there?
The basic answer is that there are maybe 2 or 3 species of rodents in Australia that have specialized on greens.
Okay.
But they are basically insignificant. They have such a restricted habitat, such slow pace of life. All of them are verging on extinction now. None of them are large. They're all just basically small rat size. Yeah. And there's a glaring hole in the Australian rodent fauna. The Australian rodent fauna is rich to the degree that if you combine the bats and the rodents, there are actually more species of these placental mammals than there are species of marsupials. So there's nothing shoddy about the Australian rodent fauna in terms of numbers of species and genera. But none of them has even come close to emulating what you find in the Pampas, because there are no grass-eating rodents of the same sort. I mean, in the northern savannas, in the Mitchell grasslands, which are the closest thing in America to prairie, you do have a species of rattus, the same genus as the sewer rat, that is an important herbivore simply because it has eruptions in which it comes out in tremendous numbers after good years and eats grass as part of an omnivorous diet. And so you could say that that particular rat is important in the Mitchell grasslands of Australia as a herbivore, but it's nothing like as specialized and certainly not as big and not as constant in its impact on the ecosystem as we have in the Pampas. And so Australia is really, essentially you can write it off. It doesn't have anything comparable to a cavy or a capybara or a koipu or a plains viscacha.
Which does fit the hypothesis that it's potentially the fertility of the Pampas that has enabled these rodents to dominate, because Australia is, of course, the nutrient poor continent, and the Pampas is perhaps on the other side of the continuum, just the most super rich, super fertile grassland imaginable. You wanted to discuss how climatic change may have favored the rodents on the Pampas over the large mammals as one moves from the Pleistocene into the Holocene.
Well, yes, we've touched on this in a previous segment. Essentially, what we seem to have gone from is a relatively dry climate in the late Pleistocene to a mesic and very favorable climate in the Holocene, in which the corresponding vegetation change was from a savanna, an open savanna, possibly including thorn trees and shrubs, to a treeless grassland. And there's some hypothetical reason to believe that, the former situation, the relatively dry thorn savanna, would be more ecologically suited to ungulates than to rodents, simply because when a system is less productive and more patchy in its resources, the mobility advantage of a hoofed animal or of a large animal matters, because in a relatively dry savanna, you often can't get all the resources together that you need, including not only water but also trace elements, without having some kind of fairly long-range movement, either seasonally or irregularly. And so large animals tend to have an advantage in heterogeneous and, if you like, substandard environments, where you can be a large animal, but only by dint of moving across the landscape in a certain efficiency that allows you to get enough of everything within a certain period of time. But with the transition to the Holocene, essentially the Pampas became, as you've several times said, an ideal environment, in the sense that basically every hectare of it was optimal in its combination of resources, water, nutrients, and so on. And so there's no need to move around. And so you can be as productive in a viscachera, a colony of the plains viscacha, in which you live underground in a number of burrows, and then you come out and forage gregariously. By the way, one of the interesting aspects of the plains viscacha is that it's a lawn-forming animal, like an ungulate. And so you have this extremely localized situation where a particular viscachera, a complex system of burrows made by the plains viscacha, can last for decades or even centuries, even though there's a rapid turnover of the individuals inhabiting those same burrows. The males in the plains viscacha only last maybe a year, because all of the adult males, which are particularly large relative to females, in a colony of the plains viscacha are turned over every year. And so there's a tremendous turnover of individuals in keeping with the fecundity and the offtake rate by predators. But there's tremendous permanence in the sense of the burrow system, a little bit like a termite mound. If you envisage the possibility that a termite mound could be inhabited by successive colonies of individuals through time. So it's an extremely sedentary system, and that does seem to be explained by the ideal combination of resources. Yeah,
fascinating. And in part one of Pampas Puzzles, we discussed how it was strange that the Pampas was not a forest, given how wet the climate is. And there's an analogy with what we're discussing in this episode, in that as you move from the Holocene, the Pleistocene drier climate into the wetter Holocene, one ecology 101 lectures, you would expect trees to move into the system, and you would perhaps also expect large mammals to thrive. But we have exactly the opposite in the Pampas, with small rodents dominating and grass dominating. So are those puzzles something we want to end on here? Do we want to put forward our best explanations, Anthony, to bring the series to a close? How would you like to tackle that, or just leave them as open-ended, wonderful puzzles?
Well, I'd suggest we leave them as open-ended. There's no literature on this subject, and so the best we can do is just put out a series of conceptual frameworks and, invite other people to investigate. But I think we should have at least one further segment on the Pampas to tell something of the remarkable history of human occupation of the Pampas, because we haven't really fully sketched out the remarkable explosion of feral animals that we mentioned in Pampas 1. We touched on it, but I think we need to go into more detail about the whole historical transition from a Pampas with indigenous hunter-gatherers and rodents through to, after 1500, for a couple of centuries, a Pampas of feral herds, abundant feral herds of the domestic horse and the domestic bost, through to the Gaucho period, where slowly but surely Europeans managed to edge their way into the Pampas despite the formidable defense of the equestrian Native Americans that lasted for more than 1.5 centuries. They just couldn't get into this fertile place because the Native Americans, having adopted the horse in much the same way as on the wide west of North America, were ferocious enough to repel them. And then finally, with the subjugation of these equestrian Native Americans, Western farming was able to encroach on the Pampas in short order, to the degree that today you don't drive across it as a treeless grassland. Most of the area is intensely farmed, and the remaining treeless grasslands are mainly where it's flooded and hasn't been drained yet. So that whole situation is interesting enough, not only ecologically, but also anthropologically and historically, that maybe we should devote one more section to it.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. A parting question, if I may. What are the main predators of those rodents? I know there's a Pampas cat, but one would have expected quite a proliferation of rodent eaters through the Holocene on the Pampas.
Yes, well, there's certainly at least one species of canid and one species of felid. There are probably birds as well. So, there's no large predators on the Pampas at the time of Spanish arrival, as far as we know. The puma was possibly there, and that's an animal about leopard size. But you don't necessarily need large carnivores to deal with animals of the size that we're describing here. And given that humans were important in the system, there's no real big puzzle about predation on the Holocene Pampas.
Right. Yeah, it's quite a thought to think that humans were possibly the main hunter of all those rodents over 10,000 years in the Holocene.
Yes, it is possible. That's not a fully convincing scenario, because when the Spanish arrived, it's not like they encountered dense populations of humans. They certainly encountered people, but it's not like there were any. There were no towns, for example. There was no permanent settlement anywhere on the Pampas. The people were living very much like forlorn hunter-gatherers, in the sense that they had no permanent dwellings. They had movable leather tents, and so they were living a very basic life, and apparently not in large numbers. But it's hard to assess because we don't have any data,
Yeah.
And we can't really say whether there's an incongruity between the incidence of people and the available prey.
Okay. So it's puzzling why they would have been why they would need to move, given the fecundity of the rodents. In a southern African context, one immediately thinks of needing to move because of drought. If one's a hunter-gatherer, you may need to move into an area that isn't as dry. But in the Pampas, it was a wet ecosystem. So do you think they depleted the rodent resources and they needed to move, or just too difficult to even speculate?
Oh, that's really difficult to speculate.
Yeah.
There's no line of evidence one way or the other. Yeah, I think for me, the main question, I wouldn't even say it's a puzzle, but the main question is, what is the relationship between a fertile grassland that is pumping with fecund rodents and the human population density that arises from that situation, given that humans are the main predator on those rodents? Because once you acknowledge that those rodents were in some way as productive as large ungulates, including livestock, if they had been there, then the question is, imagine a plane that's pumping with livestock, shall we say, feral livestock, for example. How many people would you expect? And would you expect those people to aggregate in the sense of making towns or permanent settlements? Or would you still have, despite that fecundity and that prey base, would you still have essentially a sparse population of wanderers, or people just simply subsisting hand to mouth by ad hoc hunting? It's difficult to say.
No, absolutely. Interesting thought experiment. Good. Any parting thoughts, Anthony, or should we wrap up?
Well, let's wrap up. To listeners, thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share. And we look forward to seeing you for the next segment, not only about the Pampas, but also of many other things in due course. So
excellent.
Cheers.
So thanks.
Over and out from me. Yeah.
Thanks, Anthony. Cheers.
Thank you, and over and out.